Once a month, Paula Pant, host of the Afford Anything podcast, answers voicemail questions the listeners send in. Here's one now.
Hi, Paula. I would like to remain anonymous. I am paying way too much for rent. I live in the Denver area, and I am interested in purchasing a home, not just because rent is so expensive, but also because I would like to purchase a property that I could eventually use for rental income, to get rental income. I am planning on purchasing my home with funds from a 401k and my savings account, and it's just barely enough to make a decent down payment, but it still doesn't give me the best rate, but it gets me what I would want. So basically, I just wanted your advice on what you would do in my situation, and whether I should continue pursuing this purchase a home idea or just totally give up, given that the market is really expensive, but just keep paying the high rent. And it's not like I'm, eating ramen noodles every day. I do have enough to save monthly, and I, eat pretty good. So, I do have money at the end of the day, but paying so much in rent just seems like a terrible idea. So, just wanted your opinion on that. Thank you so much for everything.
All right, here's what I want you to do. Go to a mortgage payoff calculator. We will link to a few of them in the show notes. And look at the amount that you would be spending on interest plus taxes plus insurance, plus, if applicable, HOA fees, which may or may not be applicable, plus, and this may or may not be in the calculator, repairs and maintenance. Those are all of the bills that you would be paying that would not go towards the equity in your home if you were to become a homeowner. And what that means is that buying a home, buying a personal residence, may not necessarily be a good idea, particularly if A, you don't plan on living there for very long, B, you have a high interest rate, or C, if it's going to really create a hardship in your life. And even if this is something that you eventually would want to do, in many markets, there is no huge hurry to go into this right away. Now, let's look at some actual numbers, because what I'm speaking about right now sounds very broad. It sounds a little ambiguous. So I don't know what your rent is. I don't know exactly what your situation is, but let's walk through a hypothetical case study, right? Let's assume that you're looking at a property that would cost $300,000. And let's assume that you plan on staying there for 5 years. Again, I don't know your situation, but you sound, based on your voice, you sound young, and you may have career mobility. You may get a job offer in a different city. You may decide to pursue a relationship with somebody, and that ends up taking you to a different city. So let's assume that your mortgage rate is 4.5%. And in your question, you mentioned that you didn't have a large amount of money for a down payment. I'm going to assume that you're taking out an FHA loan and making a 4% down payment. So that means a down payment of $12,000. We'll assume it's a 30-year mortgage. We'll assume that in your area, both the price of homes and the price of rent grow in the future at the same rate. We're just going to call it 3%. We'll also assume that inflation is 3% moving forward. We'll assume that any excess money that you would have, alternate uses for your savings would go into a broad market index fund that would give you, over the long-term annualized average, a 7% investment return. I'm going to assume that your property tax rate is 2%. So that's $6,000 in the first year that you'd own the home, and more every subsequent year as the value of the home rises. And I'm going to assume that your transaction costs when buying and selling the home are 4% on the front end, 6% on the back end. I'm going to assume that maintenance on your home costs 1% of the total value of the property, so that's $3,000 a year. I'm going to assume that homeowners insurance is 0.5% of the value of the property, so that's $1,500 per year for the first year, and more so thereafter. Let's say that additional utility payments that are above and beyond what you would pay on your rental right now are, let's say, an extra $100 per month. And we're just going to assume that you don't have any HOA fees. In this situation, if you can rent a place, if you can rent a home that you are happy with for $1,600 a month or less, renting is actually a better deal. Now, that's according to the New York Times buy versus rent calculator, which I'm going to link to in the show notes. And how this is calculated is that it does not just look at a limited data set, which unfortunately is what a lot of people do when they're looking at buy versus rent. This calculator actually takes into account what is the opportunity cost of keeping your money tied up and not putting it into alternate investments. What is the expected rate of return on that? What is the expected rate of growth of both home values and rental prices? How much are you paying in maintenance, in property taxes, in insurance, in interest on that mortgage? What are your transaction costs when buying and selling the house? It looks at all of those variables. And when you start to do the math on those, home ownership is not the slam dunk case that many people believe it to be, particularly in expensive markets. I'm going to link to an article that I wrote on affordanything.com. This is a long article. I think it's somewhere around maybe 6,000 words or so that dives deep into the rent versus buy question when it comes to your personal residence. Now, there was one thing that you asked about. You said that you wanted eventually to turn your primary residence into a source of rental income. That is not a wise approach in terms of thinking about it, because you buy a personal residence based on personal and emotional factors, such as where you want to live, personal satisfaction, proximity to your job. You buy your primary residence based on those personal needs, and those personal needs have no correlation with whether or not a particular property is a good investment. So when you buy a personal piece of property, buy a personal piece of property. And when you buy an investment, buy an investment. Do not conflate the two. Your investment properties should not be properties that satisfy your personal desires. They should be properties that have good cap rates, period. You know, my condo, I live in Las Vegas, which is a low cost of living area. And yet, even in this area, the interest plus taxes plus insurance plus HOA fees on my personal property are equivalent to what a person would pay in rent for this same piece of property. So I am actually not saving any money by owning rather than renting. In fact, arguably, I am losing money by virtue of the fact that I have a down payment tied up in this, and that is down payment money that otherwise could have been placed in the markets, generating a much more substantial return. So even here in Vegas, which is a low cost of living area, buying is not necessarily a slam dunk case. And the more expensive of a city you live in, the more that the price to rent ratios within that city are skewed, the less likely it is that home ownership is a slam dunk case. So TLDR, I wouldn't tell you to give up on your dream of home ownership. I would just question if you're doing it for the right reasons, because it sounds to me as though you are doing it based on what I hear in your question. It sounds as though you're coming at this from the framework of you dislike the emotional pain of writing a rent check. But what I want to hear you say is I've actually done the math, and the math says owning is a more financially solvent decision than renting in my particular set of circumstances. If that is the case, then awesome. Save up a down payment. Don't give up. Save up a down payment and buy a house. But if your sole motivation is the emotional pain of writing a rent check, then you haven't quite assessed the situation thoroughly enough yet to be able to make a decision as to whether buying versus renting is right in your circumstance. Again, I'm going to link to a long article about this, plus several calculators in the show notes. Those are available at affordanything.com/episode 90, and that will go deep into depth about this. Thank you so much for asking that question, and best of luck with whatever you choose.
Hey, did you enjoy this excerpt from the Afford Anything podcast? Then be sure to subscribe to Paula's YouTube channel. Not only is every podcast episode and Ask Paula question released here on YouTube, other creative deep thought videos are created just for you. Remember, you can watch anything, just not everything. Fill your YouTube viewing time with more videos to make you think and grow so you can afford anything. Go ahead, hit that little red subscribe button. We'll take care of the rest.